Take a look at these butterflies. Their wing patterns look incredibly similar, which is to no surprise because they come from the same region of northern Peru. However, these butterflies exhibit distinctly different phenotypes in different localities. They can teach us something about frequency-dependent selection. Today, we will be diving into this question. What is frequency-dependent selection? Frequency-dependent selection is when the fitness of a phenotype is dependent on the frequency at which it occurs. In other words, the abundance of a phenotype impacts its fitness. Frequency-dependent selection can be either positive or negative. Positive frequency-dependent selection is when the fitness of a trait increases as it becomes more common in the population. On the contrary, negative frequency-dependent selection is when the fitness of a trait decreases as it becomes more common in the population. Malaria mimicry is an example of positive frequency-dependent selection through reinforcement of warning signals. It is when two species, like the viceroy and monarch butterfly here, are toxic to predators and evolve to look similar. The mimicry of the more common warning signals leads to better protection against predators. In situations where there is unequal frequency of phenotypes, predators learn to avoid prey through negative encounters, conferring greater survival to the more abundant warning signals. Today we will explore frequency-dependent selection through three unique examples: butterfly warning coloration, rewardless flowering plants, and asexual mites. Let's go back to the butterflies we started the video with. These tiger butterfly patterns serve as warning signals to predators, and butterflies with more common warning signals are best protected. For example, the wing pattern on the Heliconius pneumata terrapotensis and Melena menophilus, or phenotype 2, is highly protected in these two localities where it is abundant. However, only 10 kilometers away in High Pongo and Low Pongo it is strongly attacked. Positive frequency-dependent selection tends to decrease variation as it favors more common traits. More frequent traits have higher fitness, leaving those with rarer phenotypes more disadvantaged. In the case of the H. pneumata tiger pattern butterflies, positive frequency-dependent selection could lead to fixation of the most common, best protected phenotype. However, the same research group found that frequencies of phenotypes were maintained. They determined that antagonistic frequency-dependent selection stabilizes wing pattern frequency through mate preference, specifically female discrimination towards its own morph. Negative frequency-dependent selection on wing pattern alleles from mating preference of dissimilar phenotypes maintains polymorphism, while positive frequency selection favors survival of butterflies with the most common morph. Flowering plants, in addition to malaria mimicry, are another common example of positive frequency-dependent selection, as pollinators recognize rewards in plants that they encounter more often. However, a rewardless flowering orchid species demonstrates negative frequency-dependent selection. Its purple and yellow flowers can be found scattered across Europe. Pollinators like bumblebees switch between flower colors due to reduced rewards from one color morph, increasing visits to another. As a result, the rare color morph is proportionately over-visited, leading to maintenance of relative frequency of color polymorphisms. We discussed two examples of sexual organisms and frequency-dependent selection, but what about asexual organisms? Maintenance of genetic variation in asexual organisms is quite elusive and not as well studied, but negative frequency-dependent selection is found to have maintained clonal diversity in the blue oat mite species, the Penthalus major. Researchers engineered a bottleneck to create different clonal frequencies and found that rarer clones were more fit due to possible mechanisms such as clonal competition and differential resource utilization. The frequency of a clone in subsequent generations was found to be lower if its frequency was high in previous ones. This leads us to the conclusion of this video. To reiterate, frequency-dependent selection is an evolutionary process in which the fitness of a trait depends on its frequency. Commonly, positive frequency-dependent selection is thought to decrease variation, while negative frequency-dependent selection is thought to increase variation. There are many more variables and factors that play into the processes of evolution, with one 2018 study finding negative frequency-dependent selection acting specifically on older females of the Pacific salmon species seen here. They are observed to have greater fitness when they are less abundant. These examples that we went through today highlight how frequency-dependent selection shapes populations by influencing which traits persist over time. While general patterns suggest that positive frequency-dependent selection reduces variation and negative frequency-dependent selection maintains it, real-world cases such as in the tiger butterflies, rewardless orchids, and asexual mites demonstrate the complexity of evolutionary dynamics across different species.